Charlas de la noche. Palabras con imagen. El análisis de los acontecimientos que influyen en nuestra vida con el periodista Francisco Durán Rosillo.
Durán Rosillo te saluda y los saluda a todos ustedes, su amiga María Celeste Raraz, para invitarlos a que se suscriban a mi canal de YouTube, María Celeste Raraz, tal como mi nombre, donde les informo todas las semanas sobre entrevistas que tienen un tema que ayuda a mejorarnos como personas y de paso son interesantes. Las pueden encontrar en mi canal de YouTube, así que los espero. Y se suscriben gratis.
Vamos a mandarle un mensaje al presidente Bukele. Desde esta plaza, desde este lugar, le queremos decir a usted, presidente Bukele, que Chile le está agradeciendo a usted como presidente de El Salvador porque nos está mostrando el camino de cómo hay que liderarse de la delincuencia, de cómo hay que liderarse de los narcotraficantes, de cómo hay que liderarse de personas corruptas como este presidente Boris. ¡Viva Bukele! Y usted tiene razón, presidente Bukele, usted tiene razón. Los chilenos somos más que este presidente. Somos más, somos mejores y no somos ladrones. ¡Viva Chile!
Sanando el cuerpo con la comida. Eres lo que comes, somos lo que comemos. Saludos. Sopita de pollo.
See, if you watch it, is primarily about the war in progress, the war in Ukraine, how it started, what's happening, and most pressingly, how it might end. One note before you watch. At the beginning of the interview, we asked the most obvious question, which is, why did you do this? Did you feel a threat, an imminent physical threat? And that's your justification. And the answer we got shocked us. Putin went on for a very long time, probably half an hour, about the history of Russia going back to the 8th century. And honestly, we thought this was a filibustering technique and found it annoying and interrupted him several times. And he responded he was annoyed by the interruption. But we concluded in the end, for what it's worth, that it was not a filibustering technique. There was no time limit on the interview. We ended it after more than 2 hours. Instead, what you're about to see seemed to us sincere, whether you agree with it or not. Vladimir Putin believes that Russia has a historic claim to parts of western Ukraine. So our opinion would be to view it in that light, as a sincere expression of what he thinks. And with that, here it is. Mr. President, thank you. On February 22nd, 2022, you addressed your country in a nationwide address when the conflict in Ukraine started. And you said that you were acting because you had come to the conclusion that the United States, through NATO, might initiate a, quote, surprise attack on our country. And to American ears, that sounds paranoid. Tell us why you believe the United States might strike Russia out of the blue. How did you conclude that?
It's not that America, the United States, was going to launch a surprise strike on Russia. I didn't say that. Are we having a talk show or a serious conversation?
Here's the quote. Thank you. It's a formidable serious talk.
Because your basic education is in history, as far as I understand.
Vamos a tener una entrevista o una conversación.
So if you don't mind, I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please.
Permíteme darte todos los antecedentes
Let's look
históricos
where our relationship with Ukraine started from.
sobre la relación
Where did
con
Ukraine
Ucrania.
come from? The Russian state started gathering itself as a centralized statehood, and it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862.
En el año
When the townspeople of
1862
Novgorod
se
invited a
estableció el
Varangian
Estado
prince,
ruso
Rurik,
y allí
from
es donde
Scandinavia
empieza
to
la
reign.
relación con Ucrania como un Estado ruso de la Unión
In
Soviética.
1862, Russia celebrated the 1000th anniversary of its statehood. And in Novgorod, there is a memorial dedicated to the 1000th anniversary of the country. In 882, Rurik's successor, Prince Oleg, who was actually playing the role of regent at Rurik's young son,
по сути, функция регента,
because Rurik had died by that time, came to Kiev.
к этому времени пришел в Киев, отстранил от власти двух братьев,
He ousted two brothers who apparently had
членами дружины Рюрика,
once been members of Rurik's squad.
имея два центра в Киеве и в Новгороде.
So Russia began to develop with two centers of power, Kiev and Novgorod.
Следующая очень значимая дата в истории
The
России
next very significant date in the history of Russia was 988.
Владимир,
This was the baptism of Russia, when Prince Vladimir, the great-grandson of Rurik, baptized Russia and adopted Orthodoxy, or Eastern Christianity.
централизованная российская
From this time, the centralized Russian state began to strengthen. Why? Because of the single territory, integrated economic ties,
один язык,
one and the same language, and, after the baptism of Russia, the same faith and rule of the prince. The centralized Russian state began to take shape.
российское государство.
Back in the Middle Ages, Prince Yaroslav the Wise introduced the order of succession to the throne.
Введение престола наследия,
But after he passed away, it became complicated for various reasons.
чуть-чуть попозже, после того, как он ушел из жизни,
The throne was passed not directly from father to eldest son, but from the prince who had passed away to his brother, then to his sons in different lines.
потом сыновьям по разным линиям. Все это привело к
All this led to the fragmentation and the end of Rus as a single state.
раздробленности.
There was nothing special about it. The same was happening then in Europe.
Но это раздробленное русское государство стало легкой добычей.
The fragmented Russian state became an easy prey to the empire created earlier by Genghis Khan. His successors, namely Batur came to Rus, plundered and ruined nearly all the cities. The southern part, including Kiev, by the way, and some other cities, simply lost independence, while northern cities preserved some of their sovereignty.
Но часть суверенитета сохранили.
They had to pay tribute to the horde, but they managed to preserve some part of their sovereignty. And then a unified Russian state began to take shape with its center in Moscow.
Оно начало
The southern part of Russian lands, including Kiev,
тому центру, который
began to gradually gravitate towards another magnet, the center that was emerging in Europe.
его даже называли Литовская Русь.
This was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania.
Составляли значительную
It was even called the Lithuanian-Russian Duchy, because Russians were a significant part of this population.
главными
They spoke the old Russian language and were Orthodox.
объединение, уния Великое княжество Литовское.
But then there was a unification, the union of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland.
Уже в духовной силе.
A few years later, another union was signed,
Священников подчинилась власти.
but this time already in the religious sphere.
И таким образом вот эти земли
Some of the Orthodox priests became subordinate to the Pope. Thus, these lands became part of the Polish-Lithuanian state.
полячиванием этой части населения. Язык внедряли туда свой.
During decades, the Poles were engaged in Polonization of this part of the population.
Они живут в Украине.
They introduced their language there, tried to entrench the idea that this population was not exactly Russians,
На окраине.
that because they lived on the fringe, they were Ukrainians. Originally, the word Ukrainian meant that the person was living on the outskirts of the state, along the fringes, or was engaged in a border patrol service. It didn't mean any particular ethnic group.
Поляки всячески
So the Poles were trying to,
относились
in every possible way, to colonize this part of the Russian lands and actually treated it rather harshly, not to say cruelly. All that led to the fact that this part of the Russian lands began to struggle for their rights.
писали письма.
They wrote letters to Warsaw demanding that their rights be observed and people be commissioned here, including to Kiev.
I beg your pardon, can you tell us what period? I'm losing track of where in history we are. The Polish oppression.
Perdone que lo interrumpa, pero he perdido la secuencia de lo que me está diciendo dentro del marco de la historia.
Это было в 13 веке. Значит, и
Now I will tell you what happened later
и назову даты, чтобы не было путаницы.
and give the dates so that there is no confusion.
В 1600,
And in 1654, even a bit earlier,
чуть раньше даже, люди, которые контролировали
the
власть,
people who were in control of the authority over that part of the Russian lands
La gente que estaba en control de la
addressed
autoridad de esos
Warsaw, I
territorios
repeat,
rusos,
demanding that they send them to rulers of Russian origin and Orthodox faith. When Warsaw did not answer them, and in fact rejected their demands, they turned to Moscow, so that Moscow took them away.
чтобы вы не думали, что я что-то придумал.
So that you don't think that I'm inventing things.
Toda la gente estaba demográficamente integrada, tanto en lenguaje
I'll give you these documents.
como en
Well,
la iglesia
it doesn't
ortodoxa.
sound like you're inventing it. I'm not
Deja que
sure
mi
why it's relevant
asistente
to
me
what
dé
happened.
esta
Не-не-не,
carpeta que te quiero
Still.
compartir.
Документы из архива.
These are documents from the archives, copies.
Здесь письма.
Here are the letters from Bogdan Khmelnytsky,
Контролировал власть
Tópicos sobre
the
todo
man
lo
who
que
then
te estoy
controlled the
diciendo,
power
pero
of this
ya en
part of the
detalle.
Russian lands
в Варшаву.
that is now called Ukraine. He wrote to Warsaw demanding that their rights be upheld,
Просьбой взять их.
and after being refused, he began to write letters to Moscow, asking to take them under the strong hand of the Moscow Tsar. There are copies of these documents. I will leave them for your good memory. There is a translation into Russian. You can translate it into English later. Russia would not agree to admit them straight away, assuming that the war with Poland would start. Nevertheless, in 1654, upon the Russian assembly of top clergy and landowners, headed by the Tsar,
Часть древнерусских земель
which was the representative body of the power of the old Russian state, decided to include a part of the old Russian lands into Moscow Kingdom. As expected, the war with Poland, it lasted 13 years, and then in 1654, a truce was concluded.
вечный мир, как это было.
And 32 years later, I think, a peace treaty with Poland, which they called Eternal Peace, was signed.
Отошла Россия.
In these lands, the whole left bank of Dnieper, including Kiev, went to Russia,
Затем, во времена
and the whole right bank of Dnieper remained in Poland.
все исторические земли.
Under the rule of Catherine the Great, Russia reclaimed all of its historical lands, including in the south and west. This all lasted until the revolution. Before World War I,
Организации
Austrian General Staff relied on the ideas of Ukrainianization and started actively promoting the ideas of Ukraine and the Ukrainianization.
в преддверии мировой войны,
Se vino la idea de
было стремление
ucranizar
ослабить.
ciertos
Their motive
sectores.
was obvious.
Así como
Just before
Ucrania
World
ya se
War
había
I,
hecho
they
parte
wanted to weaken the potential enemy and secure themselves favorable conditions in the border area. So the idea which had emerged in Poland that people residing in that territory were allegedly not really Russians, but rather belonged to a special ethnic group, Ukrainians, started being propagated by the Austrian General Staff.
которые говорили необходимо
As far back as the 19th century, theorists calling for Ukrainian independence appeared.
украинской независимости.
All those, however, claimed that Ukraine should have a very good relationship with Russia.
Настаивают. Вот.
They insisted on that.
После революции 1917 года
After the 1917 revolution,
старались восстановить государственность. Развернулась
the
гражданская.
Bolsheviks sought to restore the statehood, and the civil
Demasiado
war began.
extenso el tema histórico, le voy a adelantar un poco para avanzar.
People who exterminated Jews, Russians, and Poles are alive.
Сегодняшний Украина
And the president, the current president of today's Ukraine, applauds him in the Canadian Parliament, gives a standing ovation. Can we say that we have completely uprooted this ideology if what we see is happening today? That is what denazification is in our understanding. We have to get rid of those people who maintain this concept and support this practice and try to preserve it. That is what denazification is. That is what we mean.
Right. My question was a little more specific. It was, of course, not a
Mi
defense
pregunta
of
es específica y espero
Nazis
no se
or
ofenda.
otherwise. It was a practical question. You don't control the entire country. You don't control Kiev. You don't seem like you want to. So how do you eliminate a culture or an ideology or feelings or a view of history in a country that you don't control? What do you do about that?
Una influencia de un país
А вы знаете,
que no se
как вам не покажется странным, в ходе переговоров в Стамбуле,
You know, as strange as it may seem to you, during the negotiations in Istanbul, we did agree that we have it all in writing. Neo-Nazism would not be cultivated in Ukraine, including that it would be prohibited at the legislative level. Mr. CARLSON, we agreed on that. This, it turns out, can be done during the negotiation process. And there's nothing humiliating for Ukraine as a modern civilized state. Is any state allowed to promote Nazism? It is not, is it? That is it.
ведь нет, правда? Вот и все.
Will there be talks, and why haven't there been talks about resolving the conflict in Ukraine, peace talks?
Они они дошли до очень высокой стадии согласования позиций.
There have been. They reached a very high stage of coordination of positions in a complex process, but still they were almost finalized. But after we withdrew our troops from Kiev, as I have already said, the other side threw away all these agreements and obeyed the instructions of Western countries, European countries, and the United States to fight Russia to the bitter end. Moreover, the President of Ukraine has legislated a ban on negotiating with Russia. He signed a decree forbidding everyone to negotiate with Russia. But how are we going to negotiate if he forbade himself and everyone to do this? We know that he is putting forward some ideas about the settlement, but in order to agree on something, we need to have a dialogue. Is that not right?
Well, but you wouldn't be speaking to the Ukrainian president, you'd be speaking to the American president. When was the last time you spoke to Joe Biden?
I cannot remember when I talked to him. I do not remember. We can look it up.
You don't remember?
No. Why? Do I have to remember everything? I have my own things to do. We have domestic political affairs.
Well, he's funding the war that you're fighting, so I would think that would be memorable.
Well, yes, he funds, but I talked to him before the special military operation, of course. And I said to him then, by the way, I will not go into details, I never do, but I said to him then, I believe that you are making a huge mistake of historic proportions by supporting everything that is happening there, in Ukraine, by pushing Russia away. I told him repeatedly, by the way. I think that would be correct if I stop here.
What did he say?
Ask him, please. It is easier for you. You are a citizen of the United States. Go and ask him. It is not appropriate for me to comment on our conversation.
But you haven't spoken to him since before February of 2022.
Le contesté que era mejor de parar allí porque Biden dijo que iba a apoyar militarmente Ucrania, algo que no buscaba en esa conversación Vladimir Putin como parte de la negociación.
Do you remember what I told you about my proposal to work together on a missile defense system?
Si yo te explico cómo pedí que trabajáramos juntos en
all
el
of them.
sistema de
All of them
misiles
are
de
safe and
defensa
sound, thank
para
God.
lograr acuerdos.
The former president, Condoleezza, is safe and sound, and I think Mr. Gates and the current director of the intelligence agency, Mr. Burns, the then ambassador to Russia, in my opinion, are very successful ambassadors. They were all witnesses to these conversations. Ask them. Same here. If you are interested in what Mr. President Biden responded to me, ask him. At any rate, I talked to him about it.
I'm definitely interested, but from the outside, it seems like this could evolve into something that brings the entire world into conflict and could initiate a nuclear launch. And so why don't you just call Biden and say, let's work this out?
What's there to work out? It's very simple. I repeat,
¿Qué hay aquí para hacer eso?
we have contacts through various agencies.
Я вам скажу, что мы говорим на эту
I will tell you what we are saying on this matter and what we are conveying to the U.S. leadership. If you really want to stop fighting, you need to stop supplying weapons. It will be over within a few weeks. That's it. And then we can agree on some terms. Before you do that, stop. What's easier? Why would I call him? What should I talk to him about? Or beg him for what?
And what messages do you get back?
You're going to deliver such and such weapons to Ukraine? Oh, I'm afraid, please don't. What is there to talk about?
Do you think NATO is worried about this becoming a global war or a nuclear conflict?
At least that's what they're talking about. And they're trying to intimidate their own population with an imaginary Russian threat. This is an obvious fact. And thinking people, not Philistines, but thinking people, analysts, those who are engaged in real politics, just smart people understand perfectly well that this is a fake. They're trying to fuel the Russian threat.
The threat I think you're referring to is a Russian invasion of Poland, Latvia, expansionist behavior. Can you imagine a scenario where you sent Russian troops to Poland?
Agenda rusa que no es otra cosa más que un principio de mantener la soberanía rusa con sus estados.
Because we have no interest in Poland, Latvia, or anywhere else. Why would we do that? We simply don't have any interest. It's just threat-mongering.
Well, the argument, I know you know this, is that, well, he invaded Ukraine. He has territorial aims across the continent, and you're saying unequivocally you
El
don't.
orden de lo que yo entiendo es que usted quiere invadir Ucrania porque ellos tienen territorios pues muy productivos que a usted le interesan.
It is absolutely out of the question.
Esto está fuera
You
de
just don't have to be any kind of analyst. It goes against common sense to get involved in some kind of a global war.
Pero no está aquí.
And a global war will bring all humanity to the brink of destruction. It's obvious. There are certainly means of deterrence. They have been scaring everyone with us all along. Tomorrow Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons. Tomorrow Russia will use that. No, the day after tomorrow. So what? In order to extort additional money from US taxpayers and European taxpayers in the confrontation with Russia in the Ukrainian theater of war. The goal is to weaken Russia as much as possible.
Están dejando que sus gobiernos inviertan tanto dinero en un asunto que se podría negociar en una mesa y para atacar a nuestras tropas.
Or U.S. soldiers, citizens could wind up fighting there. How do you assess that?
¿Cómo investiga usted esta situación? ¿Cómo la ve del envío de armas y
This is a provocation, and a cheap provocation at that. I do not understand why American soldiers should fight in Ukraine. There are mercenaries from the United States there. The bigger number of mercenaries comes from Poland, with mercenaries from the United States in second place, and mercenaries from Georgia in third place. Well, if somebody has the desire to send regular troops, that would certainly bring humanity to the brink of very serious global conflict. This is obvious. Do the United States need this? What for? Thousands of miles away from your national territory. Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with the national debt. More than $33 trillion. You have nothing better to do, so you should fight in Ukraine? Wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Russia, make an agreement, already understanding the situation that is developing today, realizing that Russia will fight for its interests to the end? And realizing this, actually return to common sense, start respecting our country and its interests, and look for certain solutions. It seems to me that this is much smarter and more rational.
Esto es más inteligente y más racional. Simplemente respetarnos y sentarnos en la mesa de la negociación.
Nate, I did not blow up Nord Stream. Thank you, though.
У вас лично, может быть, есть алиби, у вас лично.
You personally may have an alibi, but the CIA has no such alibi.
Do you have evidence that NATO or the CIA did it?
¿Usted tiene evidencia de que la OTAN está detrás de todo esto?
You know, I won't get into details, but people always say in such cases, look for someone who is interested. But in this case, we should not only look for someone who is interested, but also for someone who has capabilities. Because there may be many people interested, but not all of them are capable of sinking to the bottom of the Baltic Sea and carrying out this explosion. These two components should be connected. Who is interested and who is capable of doing it?
But I'm confused. I mean, that's the biggest act of industrial terrorism ever, and it's the largest emission of CO2 in history. Okay, so if you had evidence, and presumably given their security services, rental services, you would, that NATO, the US, CIA, the West, did this, why wouldn't you present it and win a propaganda victory?
¿Y por qué usted está preparando una propaganda de victoria?
In the war of propaganda, it is very difficult to defeat the United States, because the United States controls all the world's media and many European media. The ultimate beneficiary of the biggest European media are American financial institutions. Don't you know that? So it is possible to get involved in this work, but it is cost prohibitive, so to speak. We can simply shine the spotlight on our sources of information, and we will not achieve results. It is clear to the whole world what happened, and even American analysts talk about it directly. It's true.
Yes, but here's a question you may be able to answer. You worked in Germany, famously. The Germans clearly know that their NATO partner did this, and it damaged their economy greatly. It may never recover. Why are they being silent about it? That's very confusing to me. Why wouldn't the Germans say something about it?
This also confuses me. But today's German leadership is guided by the interests of the collective West rather than its national interests. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain the logic of their action or inaction. After all, it is not only about Nord Stream 1.
Le voy a adelantar otro poquito porque esto es ya polémica. Vamos a ver ya en qué concluye esto.
People who, in our view, are not connected with special services. Let me tell you a story about a person serving a sentence in an allied country of the US. That person, due to patriotic sentiments, eliminated a bandit in one of the European capitals. During the events in the Caucasus, do you know what he was doing? I don't want to say that, but I will do it anyway. He was laying our soldiers, taken prisoner, on the road and then drove his car over their heads. What kind of person is that? Can he even be called human? But there was a patriot who eliminated him in one of the European capitals. Whether he did it of his own volition or not, that is a different question.
I mean, that's a completely different. I mean, this is a 22-year-old like newspaper.
He committed something different. He's not just a journalist. I reiterate, he's a journalist who was secretly getting confidential information. Yes, it is different, but still, I'm talking about other people who are essentially controlled by the US authorities, wherever they are serving a sentence. There is an ongoing dialogue between the special services. This has to be resolved in a calm, responsible, and professional manner. They're keeping in touch, so let them do their work. I do not rule out that the person you refer to, Mr. Gershkovitz, may return to his motherland. By the end of the day, it does not make any sense to keep him in prison in Russia. We want the U.S. Special Services to think about how they can contribute to achieving the goals our special services are pursuing. We are ready to talk.
Estamos listos para hablar. Y básicamente son los highlights de esta entrevista que dura más de 2 horas, pero que yo,
The following is an interview with the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, shot February.
Te escucha.
Beatriz Pajés, la voz más acreditada de la opinión editorial en México, en Charlas de la Noche, Palabras con Imagen. Y la puedes leer en www.siempre.mx.
Buenas noches, Frank, un placer.
López Obrador convirtió la conmemoración de la Constitución en el festejo de un déspota. Fue el típico evento de un dictador. Presentó 20 reformas en Palacio Nacional a solas, sin el legislativo ni el judicial. Sentó a su lado a su esposa como si fuera vicepresidenta. Lo acompañó su gabinete para confirmar la concentración de poder. La señora Gutiérrez Müller inspiró el discurso, autora de la versión simplista y maniquea de la historia usada para dividir y envenenar a los mexicanos. Más de las 20 reformas son electoreras. Las otras, el intento de elevar a rango constitucional la ideología de la 4T, un proyecto de nación autocrático, sustentado en la desaparición de poderes y la eliminación de todos los contrapesos constitucionales. Anuncian el principio de la desaparición de la República. Claudia Sheinbaum confirmó que las 20 reformas serán la base de su proyecto de nación. López ya le impuso la agenda. López nos está diciendo otra cosa. Habrá 2 presidentes, Sheinbaum la marioneta y otro él el dictador, que moverá a su gusto los hilos desde la sombra. La candidata de Morena ocuparía solo la mitad de la silla presidencial. Tendría las asentaderas más afuera que adentro. Llevaría puesta solo la mitad de la banda presidencial. Obligada a imponer sin quitar una coma las 20 reformas, está amenazada por la revocación de mandato. López Obrador quiere entregar a Claudia el diseño de una dictadura estaliniana. No le bastó proponer que los ministros, jueces y magistrados sean electos por voto popular para que Morena los imponga. También inventa un tribunal de disciplina judicial inquisitorial para mandarlos a mazmorras en caso de que incurran en desobediencias políticas o ideológicas. López ya dijo que lo de menos es su candidata, que más le importa que los mexicanos voten por su proyecto de nación. ¿Qué nos está diciendo? ¿Que con ella o sin ella sus planes seguirían? ¿Que Sheinbaum no tiene la capacidad para garantizar la continuación de un proyecto transeccional? No hay duda, el 5 de febrero de 2024 sí pasará a la historia. Quedará registrado como el día en que el presidente de la República anunció el intento de dar un golpe al orden constitucional, con su candidata, sin ella o como sea, faltaba más.
Hasta aquí mi comentario. Buenas noches, Frank, y buenas noches a todos quienes nos escuchan en Estados Unidos, México y en otras partes del mundo. Soy Beatriz Pajés, hasta la próxima.
Las deportaciones de venezolanos se extienden por toda Europa.
Las deportaciones de venezolanos se están extendiendo por todo el mundo. ¿Por qué? Esto es muy sencillo de explicar. Cuando tienes la conducta o la capacidad de creer que todo el mundo está obligado a darte, a ayudarte, a apoyarte, nada, vaya a exigir a tu país, porque nos hemos convertido en eso, en una carga para todos los países. Desde Alaska hasta la Patagonia somos una carga. No hablemos de España, no hablemos de Portugal y infinidad de países de la Unión Europea. Entonces llegan a reclamar derechos, llegan a querer imponer sus costumbres nefastas, llegan a un edificio y el único edificio, apartamento donde se escucha ruido donde ellos viven. No quieren respetar el tránsito, las luces de los semáforos. Entonces, ¿cómo lo hacemos, hermano? No llegan con humildad, llegan a creer, a decirle a la gente: no, yo en mi país tenía 2 carros, 2 casas, yo soy ingeniero, soy arquitecto. Eso cae mal y llegan hasta con los zapatos rotos en muchas ocasiones. Entonces ya los países se están cansando, ya las políticas internas de los países ya han tomado decisiones duras, decisiones drásticas, que obviamente pues pagarán justo por pecadores, porque no los podemos meter a todos en el mismo costal. La primera oleada de inmigrantes que salió fue la que abrió el camino y les creó una buena reputación. Pero como ahora ya se dieron cuenta que cualquier mequetrefe puede salir hasta sin pasaje, por ahí dando lástima, pues recorren muchísimos países y muchísimos kilómetros. Hay gente que se ha ido a los Estados Unidos sin un peso y están allá representando una carga fiscal, dando vergüenza, no quieren trabajar, no quieren hacer nada, conocen todos los refugios, si es en New Orleans, en Boston, en Atlanta, en Detroit, donde estén. Entonces se van de un refugio para otro y pasan años y años y se llenan la boca diciendo que están en Estados Unidos y la familia en su país, quizás esperando que un día les ayuden. Y nada, porque muchos que se han ido, que uno les escribe, automáticamente no le responden, nada, estoy en Atlanta, pero no te responden por qué. Porque están en un refugio. No les da vergüenza, gente joven, llena de vida, porque esa fue la mentalidad que les metió la mortadela sideral, y entonces pues ahora ellos se acostumbraron a vivir la vida light, a que todo el mundo tiene que darles, a que es obligación. Pero si supieran que salen y les toca trabajar, entonces pues las cosas serían a otro precio. Y no dudemos mucho de que si en los Estados Unidos llega a ganar Trump, que es bastante probable, les voy a contar que van a llegar como llegaron los europeos después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial a América, incluyendo Venezuela misma, los Estados Unidos, en barcos por miles. Ese punto va a llegar, porque es que ustedes cansan a todo el mundo, hermano. Ustedes tienen cansado a todo el mundo con su altanería, con su arrogancia, con su prepotencia, con ese ego que... Entonces, bueno, empezarán las deportaciones masivas de Europa, de Norteamérica, de América del Sur, que ya hay muchísimos países trabajando en ese tipo de cosas, por culpa de ustedes mismos, hermano.
Durán Rosillo te saluda y los saluda a todos ustedes, su amiga María Celeste Raraz, para invitarlos a que se suscriban a mi canal de YouTube, María Celeste Raraz, tal como mi nombre, donde les informo todas las semanas sobre entrevistas que tienen un tema que ayuda a mejorarnos como personas y de paso son interesantes. Las pueden encontrar en mi canal de YouTube, así que los espero. Y se suscriben gratis.
Escuchaste el análisis de la noticia, transparente como el agua, con el periodista Francisco Durán Rosillo.